May 1943, over the skies of Belgium, General der Jagdflieger Eduard Hartmann pushed his Messerschmitt FW-190 into a climbing turn, tracking what should have been an easy target. An American fighter, grotesquely fat and ungainly, lumbering through the air like a pregnant cow. His pilots had been calling it the Fliegender Milchflash, the flying milk bottle, a joke, an insult to the elegant, deadly machines of the Luftwaffe. Hartmann lined up his shot, preparing to add another kill to his impressive tally of over 100 aerial victories. Then the impossible happened. The American fighter, this supposed clumsy behemoth, suddenly rolled inverted and dove. Not a panic dive, but a controlled high-speed maneuver that took it from 25,000 feet to near ground level in seconds. Hartmann tried to follow, pushing his 190 into a dive, but within moments his controls began to stiffen. His aircraft, which handled beautifully in a turning dogfight, became sluggish and unresponsive at high speed. By the time he pulled out of the dive, the American was gone, simply vanished. Hartmann returned to his base, shaken. He had been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. He had faced the best the RAF had to offer during the Battle of Britain. And in all those years, he had never encountered anything like this. That evening, Hartmann sat down and wrote a detailed report. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was not the joke his pilots believed it to be. It was fast, possibly faster than the 190 in level flight at high altitude. It was heavily armed with 8 50-caliber machine guns that could shred a German fighter in seconds. And most disturbingly, it seemed to be nearly indestructible. Reports were coming in from other units of P-47s returning to base after absorbing damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. Hartmann's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The P-47 represented a serious threat. Luftwaffe tactics would need to change immediately. German pilots could no longer rely on the superiority they had enjoyed for the first years of the war. If they tried to fight the P-47 using conventional dogfighting techniques, they would die. He sent the report up the chain of command to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Hartmann expected immediate action, orders to disseminate new tactical guidelines, perhaps authorization to accelerate development of new German fighters to counter the threat. What he got instead was silence. Then a week later, a summons to Göring's headquarters. What followed was one of the most surreal and infuriating conversations of Hartmann's career, and it marked the beginning of his transformation from loyal officer to internal dissident. Hermann Göring was by 1943 a caricature of his former self. The World War I ace who had once led the famous Richthofen squadron was now a bloated, drug-addicted megalomaniac who lived in a fantasy world of his own creation. When Hartmann entered Göring's opulent office, the Reichsmarschall barely looked up from his collection of stolen art treasures. The P-47, Göring said, dismissively, is American propaganda. Our intelligence indicates it is a crude, heavy fighter with poor maneuverability. Any competent German pilot should have no difficulty defeating it. In February 1944, Hartmann's worst predictions came to pass in the most devastating fashion imaginable. The Allies launched Operation Argument, which would come to be known as Big Week. It was a coordinated, massive assault on the German aircraft industry designed to achieve absolute air superiority before the planned invasion of France. For 6 days, waves of American B-17 and B-24 bombers escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and the new P-51 Mustangs pounded aircraft factories across Germany and occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, throwing every available fighter into the battle. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. The combat was apocalyptic. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe launched over 200 sorties against the American formations. The German pilots were brave, pressing their attacks with suicidal determination. But they were facing an enemy they simply could not match. The P-47s flying high cover dove on the German formations with brutal efficiency. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns created a wall of lead that shredded the lightly built German fighters. Hartmann personally flew multiple missions during Big Week, leading from the front as he always had. On the third day, he engaged a formation of P-47s escorting bombers over Brunswick. His wingman was shot down in the first pass. Hartmann himself narrowly avoided being killed when a Thunderbolt appeared out of nowhere, its guns tearing through his left wing. He managed to break off and escape, but it was a close call. That night, examining his damaged aircraft, Hartmann counted over 30 50 caliber bullet holes. If even one of those rounds had hit the fuel tank or the coolant system of his liquid-cooled engine, he would have been dead. The realization was sobering. A single burst could tear the wing off an FW-190. A 2-second burst could set the aircraft ablaze. And the P-47s themselves seemed nearly indestructible. German pilots reported pouring cannon fire into the big American fighters, seeing hits register, and watching in disbelief as the P-47s simply absorbed the damage and kept fighting. Hartmann had witnessed this phenomenon firsthand, and it terrified him. When the final accounting was done, the statistics painted a picture of total German defeat in the air war. The United States had produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. At peak production, one Thunderbolt was rolling off the assembly line every single hour. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering expertise, produced about 36,000 single-engine fighters total during the entire war across all types, and German production was constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. The Americans, safe behind two oceans, could produce aircraft unmolested. The kill ratios told the same story. In 1943, when the P-47 first entered large-scale combat, German fighters still achieved rough parity. But by 1944, the P-47 was achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or higher. American pilots were better trained, flying better aircraft, supported by better logistics. The attrition rate for Luftwaffe pilots became unsustainable. In 1944 alone, Germany lost over 13,000 aircrew killed, wounded, or missing. That is more than the entire pre-war strength of the Luftwaffe fighter force, and they could not be replaced. In November 1944, Hartmann did something unprecedented. He organized what came to be known as the Fighter Pilots Revolt. Along with several other senior fighter commanders, he drafted a letter directly to Göring demanding changes. The letter was blunt to the point of insubordination. It stated that the current leadership of the Luftwaffe was incompetent, that Göring's refusal to accept reality was costing German lives, that the constant interference from the high command was making it impossible to conduct effective operations, and it demanded that either Göring step down or give the fighter commanders the autonomy to run operations without political interference. The letter was signed by some of the most decorated and respected fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills between them, men who had risked their lives for Germany countless times. Hartmann knew the risks, but he and his fellow pilots had reached a point where they could no longer remain silent. Too many good men were dying because of incompetent leadership. Too many lies were being told to the German people about the state of the war. Göring's response was immediate and vicious. He called the signatories traitors. He threatened them with court-martial and execution, and he removed Hartmann from command, effectively ending his operational career. Hartmann was devastated, but not surprised. He had known the risks, but he and his fellow pilots had reached a point where they could no longer remain silent. Too many good men were dying because of incompetent leadership. Someone had to speak the truth, even if it meant career suicide. Hartmann was placed under house arrest, forbidden from flying combat missions. For a man who had lived and breathed aerial combat for his entire adult life, it was a kind of death. He sat in his quarters, listening to the reports of Allied bombers pounding German cities, knowing that the Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, unable to do anything about it. From that moment on, Hartmann was a marked man. Göring and his cronies began looking for any excuse to remove him permanently. But Hartmann did not care anymore. He had seen the future and it was written in the contrails of thousands of American bombers. The P-47 also excelled in ground attack, a role it took on increasingly as the Luftwaffe ceased to be a meaningful threat. In the final year of the war, P-47s ranged across Germany and occupied Europe, destroying trains, tanks, trucks, supply depots, anything that moved. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. The sound of the P-47's distinctive R-2800 engine became associated with death from above. German soldiers learned to fear clear weather because it meant the J-bows, the fighter bombers, would be hunting. Along with the P-51 Mustang, it systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe, not in a single decisive battle, but through relentless, grinding attrition. German cities were pounded into rubble by bombers escorted by Thunderbolts. German fighters were shot down by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The industrial capacity of Germany, already stretched thin by the two-front war, was systematically dismantled. Fuel shortages meant new pilots got minimal flight hours. The experienced aces, men like Hartmann with hundreds of kills, could not be everywhere at once. They were being slowly worn down in a war of attrition that Germany could not win. In the final months of the war, Germany was collapsing. The Soviets were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. German cities were in ruins. The economy was shattered, and the Luftwaffe, what remained of it, was flying on fumes, literally. Fuel was so scarce that training flights had been almost entirely suspended. New pilots were being sent to combat with virtually no preparation. In a last desperate gamble, Hartmann was allowed to form an elite unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was in many ways the aircraft Germany should have had 2 years earlier. It was fast, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It was heavily armed. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was deadly. But it was too little, too late. Germany was out of fuel, out of time, and out of pilots. Hartmann's unit flew a handful of missions, achieving some success, but it was meaningless in the grand strategic picture. The war was over. Germany had lost, and the Luftwaffe, once the most powerful air force in the world, had been annihilated. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hartmann, along with thousands of other Luftwaffe personnel, was taken into Allied custody. During his interrogation, American and British intelligence officers questioned him extensively about the war, about German tactics, and about the leadership of the Luftwaffe. Hartmann was brutally honest. He described Göring's incompetence, Hitler's interference, and the systemic denial that had plagued German leadership. When asked specifically about the P-47 Thunderbolt, Hartmann's assessment was unequivocal. It was one of the best fighters of the war. We underestimated it completely. Our leadership dismissed it as crude American engineering, but it was anything but. It was fast, tough, heavily armed, and produced in numbers we could never match. The pilots who flew it were well-trained and disciplined. They exploited its strengths and avoided its weaknesses. By 1944, encountering a formation of P-47s was a death sentence for inexperienced German pilots. The American officers pressed him. Why did not German leadership recognize the threat earlier? Hartmann's laugh was bitter because they refused to accept reality. They believed in German superiority with religious fervor. Any evidence that contradicted that belief was dismissed as propaganda or defeatism. I tried to warn them. I tried multiple times. But in the Third Reich, telling the truth was considered treason. Hartmann's story is a reminder that in authoritarian systems, telling the truth is an act of rebellion, and rebellion, no matter how necessary, is punished. The lesson is timeless. Ignore your enemy's capabilities at your peril. Dismiss uncomfortable truths at your own risk. And never ever confuse propaganda with reality. The P-47 was not supposed to be a great fighter. It was too heavy, too crude, too American, but it helped destroy the Luftwaffe and won the air war over Europe. Because in the end, physics and mathematics do not care about ideology. And the Thunderbolt was the reality that shattered the Nazi fantasy of invincibility. Hartmann survived the war and lived until 1996. When asked about the biggest mistakes Germany made in the air war, his answer was always the same: arrogance. We believed we were superior, and that belief blinded us to reality.